2015 was a very long time ago. Nintendo has changed a lot more than people think throughout the Switch's life cycle. Less stingy about what they do with their IP, and willing to conduct their business in a more modern fashion that would be more commonly seen amongst its competitors. Credit to them, this was largely part of the reason why the Nintendo Switch was so successful. Whereas many of their previous consoles felt like they lagged behind the competition, the primary reason the Switch felt like it's lagged through most of its life cycle was because it was handheld. Keep in mind, when the Switch released, it was in between two different console generations, and there was no competition in the handheld market. Between the Steam Deck and the PlayStation Portal and the handheld device that Microsoft is allegedly working on, the portability of a console that could somewhat keep up with the big boys was unheard of at the time. But despite that, the Switch, for the most part, has felt fairly modern. And I know most of you are immediately thinking about writing comments about how the Switch is outdated and weaker hardware, and I get that, I understand it. But my point is, if you compare it to how the 3DS was in comparison to the PlayStation 4, for example, look at it from that angle. But I suppose that's what happens when you have a hybrid console. When the conversation needs to be about the strength of a home console, it's steered in that direction. But I think there needs to be a little bit more leeway towards the Switch due to the fact that it's a handheld. Regardless of how you look at it, it's been said over and over again, but the genius of the Switch can be found in bits and pieces of what we saw in the Wii U. The Wii U in many ways was looking for a way to combine the console market with the handheld market. It wasn't the first time Nintendo experimented with such an idea. The Super Nintendo, the Nintendo 64, the Nintendo GameCube all found various ways to combine features from their handheld games into their consoles, and sometimes even letting you play those handheld games on the console. Heck, for Smash 4 on the Wii U, you could actually use a 3DS as a controller. It was funny, I remember trying out 8-player Smash when it first came out. There were like 3 people with a Wiimote and nunchuck combination, 1 person with a GameCube controller, 1 person with a gamepad in hand, and 1 person with a 3DS. I think the remaining 2 had to use a sideways Wiimote. Many people in the gaming industry have associated the vision of what the Nintendo Switch eventually became to Satoru Iwata. And if you look at the steps that led up to the Nintendo Switch, I think it's entirely possible that they're correct. But I will caveat that a company the size of Nintendo has more than one player in the game. In the same fashion that many of the good decisions were made during his lifetime, many of Nintendo's archaic and anti-consumer policies were also implemented during his tenure. Now, I don't want to turn this into an over-glorification of the past. I think there are many people upset with the current events, and they're assuming automatically that if Satoru Iwata was still around, nothing would be happening like this. In the same vein that they assumed that if Reggie Fils-Aimé was around, he also wouldn't stand for this. I've heard some very good things about both of them in the way that they practice at Nintendo, and their leadership did take place during some of the most memorable moments of my life in gaming. But like I said, Nintendo will always be bigger than who its leader is, and you can't give all of the credit to 1 or 2 people. So I don't necessarily think that if they were around, the Switch would be more affordable, would have a better gimmick, and they'd be sending us all thank you letters in the mail for purchasing. But history tells me we might be viewing the Nintendo Switch 2 in a better light if they were still part of Nintendo. For a while now, I've actually wanted to do a deep dive on the way Nintendo has changed its practices since 2015 until now. I still do to an extent, and I think some of the talking points in that potential deep dive have been coming up throughout the past week or so. And likewise, in my little notebook of discussions that I've always wanted to bring up onto this channel, one of them has always been Satoru Iwata. Believe it or not, the past few videos have not been coming up out of thin air. Almost all of the discussions that I've talked about in the past week or so are discussions that I've wanted to do on this channel. It just conveniently happened that Nintendo Switch 2 launch triggered a lot of these talking points. In the case of the late Iwata, however, this is not really my deep dive into his life, so I might end up doing an Iwata video later on, not sure yet. But given that we are getting close to 10 years since his passing, and his name has been popping up throughout the gaming world ever since the Switch 2 Direct, I figure I can do this quick video on one thing that I did want to cover if I ever did that deep dive. Many of you will remember about a year and a half ago there was a reporter that uncovered an old cassette tape of an interview that he had with Satoru Iwata back in 2004. I thought it would be fun to go through some of that interview. This interview took place leading up to the Nintendo DS, which obviously means it was also prior to the launch of the Nintendo Wii. And in many ways throughout the interview you can associate a lot of that philosophy with what we eventually saw on the Wii U, and beyond that, the Nintendo Switch even. At the time, Nintendo's biggest concern was Sony. They had just lost the GameCube and the Nintendo 64 eras back to back. And keep in mind, this was before Nintendo started taking a step back when it comes to specs. They were still in many ways developing games for gamers, and not really focused as much at the casual crowd, even if they still were to an extent. Now in fairness, they were owning the handheld market still, but Sony was about to step in with the PlayStation Portable, And while the Game Boy Advance was just released a few years ago, the threat of the looming PSP meant that Nintendo needed to do something big if they wanted to hold on to that market. Iwata in many ways knew that it was time to do something radical. He believed that the video game market had become stagnant, that there was no longer any way to drastically improve on the way games are played. So with all that in mind, during the interview, they were discussing the upcoming Nintendo DS and why it was such a drastic shift from what many would consider typical gaming. During the interview, Iwata mentions that they had already set some of the important industry standards like the plus key, or the D-pad as it's commonly known, and the A and B button. Based on these standards they set 20 years ago, games had been evolving. Graphics had become more and more gorgeous each year, and the games have become more sophisticated, or sometimes even complicated. But he believed they were reaching the limits of that direction, and he felt that Nintendo were the leaders of the industry still, despite recent sales showing otherwise. But still, he felt they knew best. His opinion was that whatever gorgeous or wonderful thing they may come up with, in the future, people will get tired of it. He said up until that point, people had been able to build up the success by making games more gorgeous and more complicated. But unfortunately, he can't see that working anymore. And as a result, a paradigm shift in the industry was necessary. And that's partially because he felt the controllers at the time that people were using were so much more complicated than the D-pad and A and B buttons that they used to have, and as such, they've eliminated the potential novice gamers that wouldn't know how to control the games. Basically, there were a lot of people that were alienated. When he was reminded that this horsepower approach was working for Sony, Iwata mentioned that looking at the past, there has never been a single success formula that had been kept forever. To those who ever learned history lessons, it's obvious. So even though in the past they were able to appeal to the gamers by simply beefing up the console, that kind of formula has to see an end sometime in the future. And he brings up the DS and its input methods as an example. How unique the new input method on it is, but also that the graphics on it are not quite as inferior to anything else in the world. These were his words, not mine. But the focus of the DS was to provide customers with quite a new manipulation mechanic, and they're glad that they're able to have machines which people can actually touch and play with, because he believed that in order to convince somebody of the beauty of the DS, they just needed to experience it, to enjoy the sensation of holding one. Because he was convinced that if all they did was talk about it and show them pretty pictures, that would never be enough. He believed people in the industry were looking forward to some kind of sea change. After they finished with the Game Boy Advance SP, former President Yamauchi proposed the idea of definitely needing to implement some kind of dynamic change, including the possibility of adapting two screens. It led to many heated discussions. The cost of having two LCD screens, the fact that humans only have two eyes, so how can they look at both screens at once? But those discussions are what eventually lead to innovation, and that would eventually lead to what we know as the Nintendo DS. Despite the fact that in the early moments, many of them were very much against the idea of two screens. Iwata gave hints about how the Nintendo he ran would differ from the Nintendo of the past, the Nintendo that he had seen key development partners neglect. Prior to the DS, they actively went out of their way to publishers and developers to brief them about the Nintendo DS. And that was something he pushed because he felt Nintendo needed to change the way they approach these things. Obviously a result of losing the third-party support in the previous generations. When he was asked about the potential failure that could be seen because the PSP would be pushing a more traditional path, Iwata stated that when Sony was introducing the PlayStation, it was believed to be an easier machine to program, specifically compared to the Nintendo 64. And the PlayStation could be introduced to the market earlier than they could with the 64. And also, PlayStation had the cost advantage when it came to the software storage medium. But he believes that what they were advocating with the optical disc can be a great disadvantage when it comes to handheld gaming. He questions its durability and the size of the unit. He believed that it would launch in a much larger size than it currently was. And with that comes all of the drawbacks such as cost and how quickly the battery could drain. But in the end, the greatest difference is the Nintendo DS can do far more than what the PSP does. And in fairness, the DS went to become one of the most successful devices in video game history, selling double the amount of units as the PlayStation Portable did. The interview tells you a lot about the philosophy of Nintendo, specifically during that time period. It's something that's always talked about, but not always coming from the same sources. The idea that Nintendo develops for the sake of making some kind of splash in the market. Throughout most of my lifetime at least, they generally did not like to release something unless it was going to offer something new, something innovative. And that could be the graphics, that could be the controllers, that could be FLUDD, gravity mechanics, motion controls, open worlds, two screens, 3D, tablets, hybrid consoles. These are Nintendo philosophies. They play against them sometimes, I won't deny that. To this day, they say that they will not release another F-Zero game because they don't believe they can do anything beyond what they did in GX, which I think is horse crap, but that's besides the point. And I've done enough whining about the Switch 2, but I do think it has something to offer. I just don't know if they're pushing it the right way. I think the game chat functionality is a lot more valuable than many people are making it out to be. The mouse controls are neat as well, but they're neat the same way Labo was. I don't think it's going to be that big of a deal. Although, at this point, I don't know. Anything is possible with this current market. Some people might say it's the best way to experience Metroid Prime 4 for all I know. But the idea of game chat, that was appealing to me. And that's primarily because I'm from the split screen generation. I believe the most enjoyable gaming experiences are when you're hovered around a TV with your friends. It's not for everybody, by any means, but it is for me. As someone who a portion of his social life is playing Mario Party Online with my family, this is going to sound dumb, but the idea of having cameras on us to see each other's reactions is pretty appealing. And while, yeah, you could just turn on a zoom feature and show everybody's face on there, that's not really the same thing, especially if the indicators are by your characters. Instead of player 1, it shows your face. I don't know, for me it seems cool. But it only seems cool if they're able to implement it properly, and that's yet to be seen. I'm still not planning on buying a Switch 2 at launch. If anything, and I get super desperate with FOMO, I might grab it secondhand a year later or something. Or I'll cross my fingers that Nintendo actually slashes the price before launch and I can just grab it then. But as bizarre as it sounds, if I do eventually decide to grab the Switch 2, it will partially be for that camera feature, specifically for the ability to make those online experiences feel a little bit more personal. But don't get it twisted, I may be speaking in a more positive light right now, but I'm still very much against Nintendo Switch 2 given its current state. But I can't just keep releasing videos whining about everything. And luckily, Galaxy 2 is starting on Saturday. Tentatively speaking, I'm planning on doing my video game retrospectives on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. I'll go into more detail about why I'm doing fewer per week when I actually start the Galaxy series, but long story short, I just didn't know how to split up the videos for that one. There are way too many galaxies where I can't just do a single one for each level, so I'm probably going to do one per world. I'm guessing by the end of it all, it'll be about 10 to 15 videos, but I'm not sure yet. But since those videos are going to be more spread out, there will be more content to pack into each one, so expect them to be closer to 20 minutes instead of the usual 10. Tuesdays and Thursdays and probably Saturdays will be reserved for discussion videos like this one. Just some random fun topics to ramble on about, ideally not stuff that's so negative all the time. And Sunday will be a bit of a wild card. If there's something super crucial to talk about, I'll talk about it on Sunday. If I'm ahead on my retrospectives, I might just upload the extra one on Sunday. We'll see. But I'll leave this video off with one final Iwata quote. He says, "Come to think about it, whatever the future product Nintendo might make, it's not the small changes we are going to be introducing. Everything Nintendo is going to create shall be very varied and revolutionary. If we cannot come up with that kind of great change, I'm afraid people are going to get tired of it pretty soon." 2 years after that moment, Sony and Microsoft delivered new, more and powerful home consoles in the market. Nintendo followed the GameCube with a relatively weak new console that had its own unusual control scheme. And it was the Wii that became the global phenomenon. Thanks again for listening. I'll see you at the next one.